Good morning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other today on country. I'm coming to you from the land of the Gadigal people, and I pay my sincere respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Thank you for joining us here at the library today. My name is Rachel Franks, and I look after the fellows here at the State Library of New South Wales. And part of that includes presenting this, our very popular Scholar Talk series. So thank you very much for your company today. As always, if you have any questions of our speaker, please pop those questions into the Q&A feature of Zoom, and I'll come to them after today's talk. Today is something a little bit different from what we would normally see. We get so much variety for our Nancy Keesing Fellowship, which explores the cultural history of New South Wales. And today's Nancy Keesing Fellow is Dr. Sarah Kirby. She's a Melbourne-based historical musicologist, and her research here at the library has been all about Sydney's British Music Society during the interwar period, and some really interesting musical relationships that she's unpacked, and she's going to share those with us now. Thanks so much, Sarah.
Thank you, and thank you for having me today. So I've just got some slides I'll get up. All right, so in the aftershocks of World War I, after several years of being cut off from the cultural centres of Europe, many in Australia felt that their country was in need of cultural renewal. In 1920, Henri Verbruggen, the Belgian director of the New South Wales State Conservatorium, endeavoured to reinvigorate the Sydney musical scene by promoting what he considered to be a local musical idiom. By that, he meant British music. He found little success in acquiring funding or really much support for this idea in Sydney itself, so he wrote to the president of the newly formed British Music Society in London. He was only asking for advice, but the unexpected reply he received was that he had been unanimously appointed representative of the BMS for New South Wales. Verbruggen quickly established a committee of other like-minded local musicians, founding the Sydney branch of the British Music Society in the late 1920. As parochial as this name might at first appear, particularly in the context of a 1920s settler colonial Australia only 2 decades out from Federation, the BMS's aspirations were international, and after they affiliated with the International Society for Contemporary Music in 1927, the Sydney branch further reinforced their cosmopolitan outlook by changing their name to the British and International Music Society in 1933. This talk explores the activities of the BMS in Sydney, situating them within contemporary discourses of both nationalism and internationalism in the context of interwar Australian cultural identity. I argue that the BMS Sydney's sometimes conflicting aims to promote Australian, British, and international musics can be seen to reflect a kind of a wider political and social ambivalence about Australia's place in the post-World War I international landscape. Interwar Australians formulated their identities in many different ways, with some looking to maintain white Australia's ties to Britain, while others believed Australia should seek to engage with the world beyond the confines of empire. The Sydney BMS's primary goal was actually to champion Australian music, kind of under this umbrella term of Britishness, and also to help develop a distinct Australian musical style. But this aim was held in a kind of uneasy balance between their desire to further the cause of British music proper, as in from the country in the other hemisphere, and also to build a tradition of international contemporary and modernist music in Australia. So I'll talk about each of these goals in turn, and where recordings exist, I'm going to try and show you a little bit of the different kinds of music that they promoted along the way. So shortly, oh, that's a terrible quality slide, Trove, you know. So shortly after Verbruggen's first correspondence with the BMS in London, he hosted an evening for the Musical Association of New South Wales to discuss the encouragement of British music at which he asked what could be done to secure public support for British music and to assist the British Music Society at headquarters to extend its influence. Founded in London in 1918, the BMS headquarters aimed to promote British composers and increase the public's musical knowledge, but also to establish a network of support for musicians and music making. To this end, they established branches really quickly all across the UK, particularly in the north of England and in Northern Ireland, but also further afield with branches in Bangalore, in Wellington, in Melbourne as well, in addition to Sydney. During the discussion evening, many of the members of the Musical Association articulated their sympathies with the views of the BMS and their aims, particularly highlighting their interest in promoting Australian music through such an organisation. And at the end of this meeting, the Sydney branch proper was formally established. So the Sydney in 1920 that this society was launched into was a really vibrant and prospering society and city. Despite the lingering shadow of war, the Spanish flu pandemic, and looming economic uncertainty, Sydney had grown to over 1 million inhabitants, replacing Melbourne as Australia's largest and most cosmopolitan and culturally dominant capital. Its prominent harbour made it a major node in an international network of communication and trade. To quote Jill Julius Matthews, it was a port of call in the ceaseless international ebb and flow of commerce and ideas that underpinned cosmopolitan modernity. The First Nations population of this area had been subjected to over a century of forced removal as part of a larger process of dispossession, and this left the Sydney's population mostly Australian-born of British and Irish ancestry, and with every new ship, they brought further tourists, itinerant workers, and permanent migrants from across the world. Sydney's inhabitants were broadly educated, and the distribution of wealth was fairly uniform. There were still a few very, very rich people and a few very poor, but it meant that entertainment, technology, and cultural activities were pretty widely accessible. New forms of entertainment boomed in this period, including cinema and the gramophone, while many still present Sydney cultural institutions began to flourish. For example, the first iteration of the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, the Conservatorium, the State Orchestra, and the Australian Music Examinations Board had all been founded in the previous decade. It was from this cultural milieu, with its community of committed musical advocates, that the first Sydney BMS committee was elected. Reporting directly to headquarters in London, Verbruggen maintained the Society's honorary representative role for 2 years until he left Australia permanently for a conducting post in Minneapolis. But while he was in Sydney, his prominence gave a really important boost to the BMS's reach. Described by Diane Collins as a considerable egotist, and as you can see here, a man who loved a glamour headshot, Verbruggen had a glittering European career as a virtuoso violinist, an orchestral player and conductor. But he accepted his position as inaugural director of the Sydney Conservatorium at the very moment his European career seemed about to catapult him into greater prominence. His time in Sydney was distinguished by a commitment to new music, determination to create intelligent and informed listeners, and an artistic identity founded on the importance of nation. These are values that were very much mirrored in his BMS. The rest of the inaugural committee were prominent local musical figures. Melbourne-born composer, conductor, and violinist Alfred Hill was elected president. Organist and choral director George Fons Orman was appointed treasurer, while Wilfred Arlam, a pianist and flautist, and Australia's first subscribing member to the BMS, having joined the parent body at its founding, he became librarian and secretary. The composer and later honorary Canadian Arthur Benjamin was prominent on the general committee, as were people like Roland Foster, who I don't have a photo of, and composers like Frank Hutchins, William Arundel Orchard, Esther Kahn, and Mary Solomon made up the first general committee. This committee membership changed frequently, with at least half the executive expected to retire at each annual meeting. And over the course of 2 decades that the Sydney BMS was active, the president's role was held by, among others, people like the violinist Cyril Monk, pianist and ABC Radio's Mr. Melody Man, Lindley Evans, Kenneth Street, who held the role at the same time as being a Supreme Court Justice, and After a heated debate in 1927 on the subject of whether women could be allowed to join the executive, Winifred Burston was elected the branch's only female president. So the newly formed society immediately set to work proselytizing for British music, with their first concert in December 1920 described as an all-British program, which attracted a large audience that Verbruggen hoped would, I quote, listen to the moderns in a receptive frame of mind. As a critic in the Daily Telegraph noted, British here was taken to mean the whole empire, with Australian composers actually really dominating the program. You can see the program here with works by Australians Arthur Benjamin, Lindley Evans, Esther Kahn, and Alfred Hill, while the British works proper, as they were called in the press, were Frank Bridges' Londonderry Air, which Verbruggen introduced as containing one of the loveliest airs in existence, and a piano quartet by Herbert Howells. Now, typically, there just doesn't seem to be a lot of recording. There are projects to record more Australian music, but they haven't done everything yet. So I haven't been able to find any recordings of any of the Australian works here, but I just thought I'd show you a little bit of Frank Bridges' Londonderry Air as a taste. The melody is sometimes known as Danny Boy, and it was also popularised around this time by Percy Grainger as his Irish tune from County Derry. So while this first program really emphasised contemporary music from Australia as well as from Britain proper, from the very next year, contemporary music from wider Europe began to appear on BMS bills. With the news that headquarters had become the British section of the International Society for Contemporary Music in 1922, in early 1923, the Sydney branch followed their lead, deciding to champion, I quote, interesting music of foreign origin. This proportion of foreign music steadily increased, and by the 1930s, programs generally contained sort of half Australian or British works and half continental music. In 1927, the Society received its formal notice of affiliation as the Australian section of the International Society for Contemporary Music, promoting further interest in international contemporary music at home, while also pursuing the promotion of contemporary Australian music overseas. As the branch developed, their activities were more extensive. They had 5 or 6 major concerts each year. These were mostly chamber recitals, but orchestral programs were also possible in the early 1920s, both through Verbruggen's association with the State Orchestra and his direct successor at the State Orchestra and Conservatorium, William Arundel Orchard, who became the BMS's second president. This led to Australian premieres of many major orchestral works, including by Granville Bantock, Samuel Coleridge Taylor, Hubert Parry, and of course, Edward Elgar. The society also cultivated relationships with radio producers after radio broadcasting began in 1923 in Australia, presenting programs on the local stations 2FC and 2BL. BMS also established a lending library funded by ticket sales to non-members, which grew from around 300 scores to over 1,000 in the first 2 years. A further highlight of the BMS calendar was an annual conversazione held in conjunction with the Royal Art Society's annual exhibition. Education was also really central to the BMS's activities. They hosted monthly evenings where new and little-known pieces acquired by the library could be demonstrated to music teachers that they could then go and disseminate to their students. And from the early 1930s, local schools could arrange for society-affiliated performers to come and give concerts. From 1927, the BMS also hosted a major annual schools competition in solo and ensemble performance. Throughout these activities, the Sydney BMS firmly focused on contemporary music. But what did they actually mean by contemporary? This is a highly malleable term, which, as Sarah Collins has demonstrated, could be mobilized to differing political and artistic ends through various definitions that privileged either periodization or by reference to specific aesthetic techniques. Despite the definition of this term actually causing much anxiety throughout the ISCM, across all of its kind of European bodies, the Sydney BMS seemed not particularly bothered about defining contemporary as a political act or as any kind of act, really. It was only when they were asked by a delegation from the local association of headmistresses to clarify what they meant by British or foreign contemporary in their schools competition that they decided to define contemporary as simply referring to living composers or anyone who died in the last 10 years. It's very simple, so straightforward. Now, at the initial meeting to establish the Sydney branch, Verbruggen argued that it was the Musical Association's duty to support a movement which is national in its appeal. By these comments, and also that content of that first program that I showed you, full of Australian works, it's clear that the Sydney BMS's idea of British music encompassed music made in Australia. And while this may appear strange today, at the time, British and Australian were not mutually exclusive terms as they might be seen now. Although early historiographies tend to view Australia in this kind of polar separation from Britain through a teleological narrative of struggle towards independent sovereignty, historian Neville Meaney argues that Britishness was actually inseparable to the formation of Australian identity. Although federation had created a single political entity of Australia, the administrative relationship with Britain took much longer to devolve. Australians were required to declare their nationality as British until 1969, and it was 1984 before they ceased to be considered British subjects. Federation itself was imagined as a triumph of democracy rather than independence, and federalism regarded as a natural outcome of British culture rather than a revolutionary separation from it. Throughout the 20th century, Australia's engagement with the world was often mediated through established imperial networks, while restrictive immigration policies promoted a white British mono-ethnic state. Now, race played a really key role in the formation of early 20th century Australian identity. The settler colonial community had been founded on the genocide and dispossession of First Nations peoples to facilitate the mass settlement of white colonists. And subsequent nation-building discourses engaged in a kind of systemic writing out of Indigenous voices and people from their narratives. For the settler community, whiteness, and in particular what Jim Berryman describes as the idea of a homogenous ethnic and cultural community that Britain provided to Australia, was just foundational for national identity. That the BMS Sydney identified with this kind of overarching Britishness is perhaps self-evident in their name, but it's reinforced by their actions, particularly when that identity was challenged. So at several points through their history, there were suggestions raised to either change the branch's name or alter their governance in a way that would de-emphasize Britishness. In 1927, for instance, it was proposed that the BMS merge with the Musical Association, largely because there were quite a few of the same people active on both committees who were sick of attending two sets of meetings, but also because they'd been co-hosting events already for some time, as you can see here. But this proposal was rejected by the membership in really strong terms. At a meeting discussing the idea, arguments noted in the minutes include the BMS is an empire body and Sydney should have its centre. Another member did not approve of any affiliations that would cause the BMS to lose its identity as an empire concern, while another opposed any scheme that would see the BMS lose its identity as a home centre, showing, I think, the stake that members really held in retaining that tangible link to Britain. It's also clear that the BMS Sydney considered music by composers born in Australia to be unproblematically British. They rarely presented concerts of British work that didn't contain at least one piece by an Australian. As you can see in this program here, for example, and I've asterisked all of the Australian works. I do have a couple of recordings of these just for a bit of an example. So here is some of Alfred Hill's Retrospect played by Larry Sitsky. And also Arthur Benjamin's Carnivalesque, played by John Harding and Ian Munro. So these works were all kind of broadly characterised as British, despite their composers mostly being Australian born and often working in Australia for most of their lives, other than, I suppose, Arthur Benjamin as an example of someone who was London trained and then left for Canada. The only concerts that contained only works by composers from what was often called Britain proper in these programs were historical in their focus, such as two concerts of English madrigals that accompanied talks by musicologists on the same topic, or in a confusingly titled celebration of the anniversary of the birth of Henry Purcell, given more than 2 months after his 272nd birthday in 1931. These events were generally considered important for their educational content and for Australians as an illustration of a shared history. Settler Australia at this time suffered from what James Gore describes as a limited sense of national and historical consciousness, meaning that maintaining ties with Britain also provided a sense of historical continuity with the old world. While much of the BMS Sydney's activities in the promotion of British music might be considered, I suppose, a benign expression of a kind of latent cultural identity, in some cases it really was just explicit xenophobia. For example, in 1928, Margaret Chalmers, the BMS official accompanist, ended up resigning from the society because of comments made by another member, Gertrude Barton, who was the secretary at the time, about Chalmers accompanying the visiting Russian singer Vladimir Elin. Barton had apparently refused to be introduced to Elin and suggested Chalmers was being disloyal and should be ashamed to be playing with a Russian. Barton refused to retract her comments, arguing that she would not consider doing so when her country is suffering such oppression. There was an implacable antagonism toward the Soviet Union in Australia at this time, with the government and large parts of the media openly hostile to the Bolsheviks following their withdrawal from World War I. Ellen was evidently not a Bolshevik fleeing Russia at the revolution, moving to a teaching post in the Philippines, but his visit seems to have prompted hostility regardless. Though there was a small amount of dissent in the BMS meetings, it was Barton, not Chalmers, supported by the society. And longtime member Roland Foster proposed a new singing competition based on British works only in the wake of this argument as a means of reiterating the branch's support for their own artists. Now, despite this shared history and the strong ethnic links with Britain, early 20th century settler Australians also developed a distinct sense of Australianness. This has been termed a civic identity, described by Russell McGregor as encompassing aspects of Australian society deemed unique. For instance, a sense of egalitarianism in opposition to the British class system. This stirred the deepest nationalist passions as expressed through art, from which Australia could begin to develop its own cultural forms, including in music, attempts to define an Australian compositional style. The interwar period was particularly fruitful in this respect. Australia had been isolated from Europe in the First World War, and by the end of the 1920s, this isolation came to be considered a cause of a kind of national backwardness, insulation, and lack of sophistication, to quote Richard White. In response, Australians began to champion a new self-conception of this kind of energetic industrial progress and independent cultural maturity. In the arts, this spurred a growing and intense concern with the national theme. And it was in this context that the championing of Australian music, as distinct from British, formed a key goal of the Sydney BMS. As you can see here, these are just a sample of some of the headlines that you get at the time, but there was much anxiety in the press about what Australian music was and also how it might be supported to develop. While Australian works often appeared on British programs on the BMS, as we've seen, the branch also hosted regular all-Australian concerts that were billed as such, and they often ended up being the most well-attended and well-reviewed of all of their performances. You can see an example of one of these programs here. And while there are occasionally works sought from other states, as in Hooper Brewster-Jones from Adelaide or Fritz Hart in Melbourne, the majority of these programs actually contained works by Sydney branch members and their colleagues at the conservatorium or in those kind of circles. A particular example is a composer like Lindley Evans, who was the president of the BMS for a while, active on the committee through its whole existence, and also performed on many of the programs. To give you a quick idea of his work, here's just a little bit of his Rhapsody performed by Janelle Carrigan. Now, I think that's a really beautiful work, but is there anything actually Australian or particularly Australian about it? Or in fact, any of these works that I've played for you so far? Any presentation of music under such a label as Australian composition provoked debate about what it actually meant and what made a piece of music Australian. The first all-Australian BMS concert in 1921 elicited much confusion of ideas, according to a critic in the journal Musical Australia, as to whether the BMS intended this to be viewed as an aesthetic category or simply emanations from composers who are Australian. They concluded that it could hardly be contended that there was anything distinctly Australian about any of these works, because it was exceedingly doubtful if Australian musical characteristics are as yet sufficiently developed to be recognisable. Now, the question of whether a distinct Australian music had existed had been discussed since the 19th century, but there was very little consensus on what, if anything, this music might actually sound like and how it might differ from European classical music. Some people cited the landscape as a possible starting point, as this had been a really important element in the representation of Australia in literature and visual art. Landscape is also often evoked in musical constructions of nation in other parts of the world, described by Carl Dahlhaus as among the permanent components of a national musical style. From the early 20th century, many Australian composers did attempt to evoke the landscape using techniques from like onomatopoeia and tone painting of the sounds of the bush and bird calls and things like that, or by using established European idioms to try and illustrate a more abstract kind of spirit of the country. In 1922, the Sydney BMS invited local composers to submit their compositions for consideration on future programs. And this prompted George de Kairos Rego, critic and father of future BMS treasurer Rex, to publish an extended Daily Telegraph piece asking what characteristics of Australian music the BMS might expect to receive. In his opinion, it could only be the landscape that separated Australian works from the European, but he cautioned that a composer from Sydney could not be inspired to the same extent as one who lived on the New South Wales south coast with the wonderful panorama of land, sea, and sky. Beyond landscape, the idea of folk song was also often discussed in this context, in particular the lack of an Australian folk tradition. In 1924, the BMS's president J. Hugh McMenamin gave a lecture on the possibilities of Australian music, arguing that Australia has no folk music, it is no land of legend, it has no musical past. And this was a common argument. Cyril Monk, another erstwhile BMS president writing in the 1930s, said that Australians did not lack taste or talent, but simply worked under the handicap of a lack of tradition. Where European composers could mine centuries of musical development of folk music for inspiration, Australians did not have this luxury, he believed. In several lectures to the BMS, McMenamin suggested that engaging with Aboriginal materials for the purpose of creating an Australian folk music tradition would be fruitless, describing First Nations culture as, I quote, singularly devoid of any musical instinct. This was also a common view at the time and one espoused in published writings by many other members of the BMS. However, at the same time, a number of settler composers in the 1920s and 30s did attempt to integrate references to First Nations musics into their works, paralleling movements in the visual arts and literature, such as the Jindy Warrabaks and the modernist painters whose nationalist aesthetic appropriated Aboriginal cultural property. Yet for the BMS, discussion of Indigenous music where it occurred at all, which was pretty rarely, it was always framed through this kind of relative value as a tool for white composers to use. In any case, despite lectures, concerts, and writing in the press, the BMS remained just fundamentally unresolved about what Australian music really was, beyond their support for locally born or long-term resident composers. In 1933, the BMS's London headquarters closed, and this left Sydney with a bit of an identity crisis. Without the parent body, the symbolic ties to empire that had kind of legitimised their activities were lost. While some members felt the society should simply continue as it was, as many other BMS branches did, other members argued for a shift in focus, suggesting that the society should continue as the Australian section of the ISCM only. After several months of debate, they decided on a compromise. They changed their name, as you can see in these two letterheads, one from 1933 and one from 1934, to the British and International Music Society, adding the description Australian Centre for the International Society for Contemporary Music to all of their publications and programs. While the International had always been an important consideration for the BMS Sydney, their new name really emphasised this strongly. As an article placed by the committee in the Sydney Morning Herald explained, this change was a positive one as they had previously been subject to criticism for being called the British Music Society while presenting a good deal of music of other nationalities. This criticism really reflects a wider conversation occurring across multiple levels of Australian society at the time. Although interwar Australian identity had been primarily shaped by the historical relationship with Britain, from its colonial beginnings, Australia had always been part of a wider international network of communication. Major cities like Sydney were in constant interaction with the world, and while maybe not necessarily multicultural, many communities were outward-looking, cosmopolitan, and embedded in international exchange. Internationalism and nationalism were not mutually exclusive categories, but rather deeply entangled, complementary features of Australian politics. As Glenda Slugger has observed, internationalism and nationalism in the early 20th century were twin liberal ideologies that stemmed from questions surrounding modernity, democracy, and progress. While the war had clearly heightened a sense of national identity, growing awareness of Australia's place in the Pacific and the accelerating pressures of mobility, communication, and consumption also saw Australia commit to a number of internationalist initiatives, including things like the League of Nations, while simultaneously maintaining a sense of nationhood and a growing international consciousness. The end of World War I saw Australia take a stronger role in international discussions, including acquiring special dominion status at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. On this stage, Prime Minister Billy Hughes brought demands of wholesale punishment of Germany, opposition to the USA's ambition for liberal internationalism, and rejection of a declaration of racial equality proposed by Japan. This kind of nationalistic chauvinism was also reflected in many of Australia's domestic policies, such as the White Australia policy. While these jingoistic positions evidently had support at home, they seem to contradict a parallel and growing interest in internationalism. Hughes himself saw the era as ripe for regional cooperation, something that was also reflected in public opinion. Equally, institutionalized internationalism saw the flourishing of non-government internationalist organizations in Sydney, whose concerns ranged from peace and security to civic education, labor, and women's rights, and in the BMS's case, the cultural sphere. For the BMS, or I should say by the 1930s, the BIMS, international music had really been central to their activities from the beginning. Early programs often featured a work or two by European composers, with Karol Szymanowski, Maurice Ravel, and composers of Les Six among the most frequently heard. The first major program to take on an international theme, however, was in June 1927 in a concert given to celebrate the branch's affiliation with the ISCM. Held at the Sydney Conservatorium and broadcast on 2FC, the program was a whirlwind tour of European music, with each work clearly delineated on the printed program by its composer's country of origin. As you can see here, ranging from Britain, represented by Goossens and Bax, we have Szymanowski from Poland, a bracket of French and Russian songs by Ravel and Gula, which is confusing because neither of these were Russian. I think they're referring to the influence of Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade on Ravel's. I don't know. There were further French music by Mio and a Hungarian work by Bartók, and I just thought I'd give you a little bit of the Allegro from Bartók's string quartet. So as I said earlier, from the 1930s, BIMS programs were often structured as half Australian or British and half another international kind of group. Sometimes the international section would offer a mix of pieces from around the world, while others tended to focus on a single composer. For example, a memorial concert given in June 1938 for Ravel and Albert Roussel, both of whom had died the previous year. Other programs focused on a particular country of origin. For example, as you can see here, this June 1934 program focused on Russian music, showing works by Borodin, Balakirev, Gracheninov, Rimsky-Korsakov, Skryabin, Prokofiev, and Medtner, some of which were performed by Russian pianist Alexander Stravinsky, who had settled in Sydney in 1925. Maintaining their focus on education, illustrated lectures also continued to be offered through the 1930s on international topics, with Lucas Stahelin delivering a series of talks discussing Swiss composers Honegger, Conrad Beck, and German composer Hindemith in 1935 and 1936. Stahelin had been a member of the ISCM Basel section before migrating to Sydney to marry an Australian woman, supposedly yodeling across the water to his fiancée as soon as the ship was within earshot. He then replaced Wilfred Arlam on Arlam's recommendation as Sydney's ISCM representative in 1939. Much of the contemporary music performed by the BIMS was sourced through local music retailers, but in the 1930s, they also actively sought new music directly from other ISCM centres around the world, with Arlam receiving packages of scores from Austria, Argentina, Cuba, the Netherlands, Poland, as well as, I feel like there was another one I've forgotten. Anyway, through this, for example, in July 1934, audiences heard works from Vienna sent by Paul Pisk, one of the ISCM's founding members. In the program you can see here, for example, there's works by Egon Kornath, Josef Marx, and Alban Berg's distinctly atonal piano sonata. And just as a final example, I thought I'd show you a tiny bit of this one too. So the reception of these works was pretty mixed. The Kornaut String Quartet was considered deeply felt and beautiful, but that Berg sonata that we've just heard was regarded as not particularly interesting, according to the press. By the same process, the BIMS also sent Australian works overseas, with one notable success being music by Arthur Benjamin and Roy Agnew being performed in Argentina, facilitated by correspondence between Arlam and Juan Carlos Paz, a founding member of the Grupo Renovación, a composers association dedicated to the promotion of modernist music in Buenos Aires and the Argentinian subsection of the ISCM. The comparative presentation of international music and concert programs that I described earlier was even more strikingly articulated on radio. The BMS were early adopters of the public broadcasting medium from the kind of mid-1920s. And from mid-1926, they had many of their live concerts broadcast on 2FC. From 1928, however, they got a better offer from 2BL, the first public station in Australia, and their string quartet then played a studio program there once a week. Additionally, more extensive studio programs were also arranged, and by the mid-30s, the BIMS were presenting an hour-long broadcast each month. The first part of each was devoted to British historical music in some sense, while the second part featured contemporary works of a different country each month. As you can see here, there are programs of contemporary music from France, Spain, Switzerland, Italy, and Finland. This kind of compartmentalized representation of music from around the world is, I think, bigger than just the BMS and reflects a particular way of thinking about or framing identity within the new Australian settler society that ties back to that search for an Australian musical identity. Throughout the Australian musical press in the 1920s and 30s, there are just dozens and dozens of articles with similar titles, things like nationalism in music, or national music, or nationality in music, or similar, where the author goes through listing different countries and then describing their musical characteristics, usually in quite an essentializing or stereotypical way. There are two examples from 1929 written by members of the BMS from Sydney, both published in Music in Australia, the journal. The first of these is Arthur Benjamin's Contemporary Music, shown in fragments here, that outlines his thoughts on contemporary music movements overall, and then goes on to give summaries of what he believes is happening in music in different countries, as well as describing, the supposed characteristics of each country. In the same year, in the same journal, Frank Hutchins wrote an article titled Nationality in Music, outlining what he saw to be the characteristics of British, German, French, Italian, Spanish, Norwegian, and American music in turn. These types of articles tend to conclude with a question about Australian music. Hutchins, for instance, concludes, "Of Australian music, it is too early to speak. Our school has yet to be formed, and we have had the great drawback of having no folk songs." So on one hand, we have this evident desire to learn about what's happening around the world and to spread knowledge of music from many different countries. But at the same time, this is clearly part of an introspective discussion about finding an Australian place in that same international landscape. So the first years of the 1940s were very bad for the BIMS. Years of economic uncertainty had depleted the Society's resources, and Australia's entry into World War II signalled further difficulties to come. Subscribers and affiliated schools began withdrawing support, and attendance at the concerts became so low that they could no longer afford to pay their artists or support their library. The BIMS's activities were wound up in November 1941, only temporarily, they said, but it was decided, but they never were to reopen. The branch remained in recess until 1946, when they had a final meeting in May, attended by only 8 people, to formally dissolve the branch, citing lack of funding, but also the very greatly stimulated musical concert world of post-World War II Sydney that they simply couldn't compete with. The branch's library was donated to the Musical Association, along with their remaining funds for its upkeep. Although their existence bordered 2 particularly difficult periods in Australian history and world history, formed out of the post-World War I need for renewal and closing in the final years of World War II, across their roughly 20 years of existence, the British and International Music Society played a really important role in the cultural life of Sydney. Practically, they provided support and infrastructure for the local musical community, but they also allowed for philosophical engagement with the world of the international and international music, and participated in active nation-building discourses. Much of the BIMS's activity was understood through cultural nationalist frameworks. The ambivalent position of the Australian, the British, and the international in this context reflects these concepts' contested nature within interwar Australian cultural identity. While the most obvious aim of the BMS was to promote British music had a specific set of meanings in the settler colonial Australian context. It could be patriotic, it could speak to imperial nostalgia, or it could provide a sense of connection to something bigger than everyday life in Sydney. International music similarly provided a means of reference to a wider world, which was important to understand as Australia negotiated its expanded place within it. Australian music was perhaps the most problematic category for settler society, and that meant negotiating and then forging a new identity. Most significantly, the BIMS in Sydney were champions of contemporary music, including explicitly modernist works, though these were rarely composed by an Australian. While some members may not have been particularly concerned with international debates about aesthetics or political agendas associated with the contemporary, they did still engage with the music. Cultural history sometimes suggests that interwar Australia was overwhelmingly anti-modernist, based on the country's preoccupation with the project of cultural nationalism, alongside the tropes of isolation and insularity reinforced by its geographic distance from Europe. This may be partly true, but as recent studies have shown, interwar Australia was not isolated or temporarily belated, as even those proponents of cultural nationalism remained engaged with international culture and modernity. certainly preoccupied with the national, Australians also kept an open interest in the world. At the same time, established imperial networks could themselves function as vectors of modernisation, allowing Australians access to a wider range of cultural offerings, rather than simply acting as a dominating force of cultural stagnation. The BIMS is a clear example of the way interwar Australians negotiated and challenged the binaries of cultural nationalism and internationalism, as well as modernism and anti-modernism, demonstrating the complex and entangled relationship between these ideas in the Australian consciousness. Despite its parochial sounding name, the British Music Society, later the British and International Music Society, had international aspirations, which were understood through a framework of Australian cultural nationalism. Initially using the networks of the British Empire to promote modern music and living composers, the Society gradually grew its international network through affiliation with the ISCM, which they used to spread knowledge of contemporary international musics in Australia and Australian music internationally. A century on from the formation of this society, the BIMS offers an opportunity to reassess Australian music making in the context of broader international currents as it responded to aesthetic and political changes and pressures through the interwar period. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. That was fabulous. And I think that you deserve a special citation for the most number of glamour headshots in a single presentation. For our fellowships program. We have lots of people coming in on the chat, thanking you very much for the detail that you've gone to today, and particularly offering us some recordings. And a few people are commenting that it felt really special to see the program there and then to actually hear some of that like they might have if they had actually attended those concerts. So thank you for all the effort that you went to for that. We do have quite a few questions coming through, and I'm going to ask this one first because this is one that I was thinking as I was listening to your presentation this morning. So this particular audience member is saying that when they first registered for your talk today, they thought that this was an especially niche topic and they wanted to know how you became interested in it. But listening to you talk about all of the things that went on and all of the people involved, they've actually come to the conclusion that this is an enormous subject, and where did you actually stop? So maybe if you can talk about what sparked your interest and where do you draw the line then about how many rabbit holes do you go down?
Yeah, that's a really good question because my research tends to be like, oh, look, a shiny thing over there, and then chase that off. Yeah. You kind of go, oh, that's not what I was supposed to be researching. So it is, I think, as musicology is sometimes a word that people aren't familiar with. It sounds like a completely made up term, but I think I tend to describe myself as a cultural historian of music. So if that gives a little bit of context, I think I got to this topic because actually I had sort of in a roundabout way ended up working on the Melbourne branch of the British Music Society because the archive for that is at the institution that I work in Melbourne and in the State Library of Victoria. And having done some work on that, seeing a couple of parallels between that and you know, references to the Sydney branch, but no one seemed to have written about it. And then I contacted the State Library of New South Wales about the archive that I'd found they had, and it was all still vacuum wrapped. Like I don't think anyone had looked at it in decades. So that was great. Felt like there was a whole project there to jump onto. Where to stop? I mean, I had pretty defined chronological space because they only existed for 20 years. So that made it a little bit easier. But in terms of, I mean, I think at the moment, I am just trying to establish what the kind of base history of this society is. And there are so many other things I could, you know, the radio piece is a massive one and something I'd love to work on further, because I think that this organization was, you know, probably, they weren't the only one, but they were very active and very kind of representative in that, and as a way of disseminating music and culture to a really, really broad audience in a new way that hadn't been possible if they'd, you know, existed 10 years earlier. But then there's, you know, a whole education thing. They had these massive conferences and competitions. You know, that's like another thesis for, you know, some years in the future. Yeah, so I think at the moment it's just what I can piece together to provide maybe a foundation for lots of other pieces of future research.
Well, we've only have a few minutes left, but I'm going to try and squash in a few more questions. Somebody's asking if you know about their relationship with the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, especially around the 1930s.
So the 1930s, they really didn't have much of a relationship with orchestral music altogether. So their connections with the State Orchestra and the Sydney Con Orchestra came about basically through personal connections, because Verbruggen was the representative for a couple of years, and then Arundel Orchard, who was also the director of both of those institutions while being president. So I think they just got to kind of use their resources. But after that, there's no orchestral programs at all.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so it does kind of give you the sense that it was a little bit of a DIY kind of organization. A lot of the committee members performed on the programs. They invited their students to play on them. It was very chamber music and solo kind of, or vocal music. Sometimes they'd get a madrigal society in to do something, but it was very kind of small scale performance.
You've mentioned a little bit about the finances of the society, but someone's coming through with a more specific question about the commercial and copyright aspects of music. And do you have any sense that the members of the BMS, as professional musicians, were earning anything from writing and playing rather than specifically just teaching? So they're sort of, especially in a period where there's a lot of competition from different types of entertainment.
Yeah, so copyright's not something I struggle with still at the moment. It's a really tricky one, with music particularly. But I think it's always been a precarious space to be employed in, I think, being a musician. And the BMS Sydney was, I think, unusual in that they made paying their performers a real priority. They didn't want to ask anybody to donate their time. So it was intended to be a professional organization as well. And there were debates about whether they should make the committee up entirely of professional kind of performing, composing musicians, or whether, the dilettantes could join. And then I think they realized that no one had time. If they didn't let sort of general interest people join, nothing would happen. In terms of sort of selling works, they had arrangements with Palings, the music company, but then that became really strained because they kept asking them to import music that then nobody would buy because it was too weird and modernist. And then, so I think sort of finances and copyright and all of those things are always really tricky. And it seemed that they were negotiating that in a difficult kind of space as well.
And I'm going to squash in one more question. How common was it for the society to program non-contemporary music? So you mentioned a madrigal concert, but it seems as though this was an outlier, unlike perhaps the Melbourne branch, which did have a bit more of a dual focus and were more overt about contemporary and early music.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So they did occasionally do madrigals, as I said. The radio programs, I think because they had to be a little bit more populist, the first half of those were often 18th or 19th century British music as a kind of historical counterweight to the very contemporary European art music. But it was very focused on the contemporary in a way that Melbourne really is quite different, I think, in that society. It's, I think also sometimes it was opportunist. So when they had those madrigal type concerts, it was because there was somebody visiting who could give a lecture on that, rather than because it really aligned with their agenda overall.
Well, so much more to explore. Obviously, a bit more work for you to do. So we'll look forward to seeing your research as it comes out in presentations and publications. We'll follow that with keen interest. So thank you, Sarah. And don't forget, everybody who's here today, please join us next time. So on the 3rd of October, again at 11 o'clock, Dr. Susha Chen will be talking to us about her research as a David Scott Mitchell Fellow. And she has been exploring women in the 1930s and 40s and Sino-Australian relations in that period. So very specifically looking at a collection of photographs here at the library of Chinese women here in Australia and the different ways that they engaged with local women and also supported their own community here in New South Wales. So bookings for that are open now. So until October, stay safe everyone, and I'll see you all again soon, either on site or here in real life at the library. Thanks again, everyone. Thank you.